in the course of your lifetime, there are a few moments which are the so-called flashbulb memories or flashbulb moments. Some of those would be more positive flashbulb moments, remembering your first time really falling in love. Others would be when something terrible happens, like a tragedy on a more personal level or on a larger national or international scale. And the interesting thing is that afterwards you're almost certain to remember details of where you were and when you got the news or experienced it. It's like your memory is intensified somehow. Like
with the 9/11 or when Kennedy was shot.
Yeah, for those who remember when Kennedy was shot. But 9/11, that's interesting. I remember it really well. It was just a week after our oldest daughter was born. I was sitting in our living room, holding her in my arms as I was watching the news, and it literally felt like, and I can remember the sounds, the smells, the feeling of all of that. I remember thinking, is this World War III or whatever is it? But I also, if I look back to my childhood or early adolescence, I remember two other incidents pretty well. On March 1st, 1986, I was on a skiing holiday with my parents and the rest of the family in the Norwegian mountains. And the kids, we woke up a bit earlier and we put on the radio. Well, this was a long time ago. You might even remember listening to the radio. And suddenly it was announced that the night before, or just after midnight, the night before, the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme had been shot and murdered on February 28th, just before midnight, after coming home from the movies. Do you remember that?
Yes, I think it was a Saturday, wasn't it?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it was a...
I remember the Saturday feeling of that day.
Yeah, it should be it, because it was the beginning of a winter holiday, I think, in the western part of Norway. So this fourth podcast of the series, The 4 Speeches Every Leader Has to Know, will deal with what do you say? How do you address? How do you speak when a large-scale tragedy strikes, or when there is suffering that you have to address as a leader? How do you speak credibly about suffering when a worker passes away, or you have to deliver a memorial address, a sort of eulogy, that is? So in this podcast, we'll analyze and discuss what we call the consolation speech, a genre where the leader has to speak in the face of tragedy and loss. I'm Bård Nordheim.
And I'm Joa Haga.
So the other incident, the flashbulb memory sort of thing, tragic incident, I remember it all too well as well, happened just a month earlier, a month before the Palme murder. On January 28th in 1986, President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, addressed the nation because earlier that day the space shuttle Challenger had exploded in the air. And we will listen to how President Reagan's consolation, or how he tries to console the nation or address the nation. But before we listen to the actual speech, we've talked about the importance of naming yourself, naming reality, naming who we are, and naming the cause. And these 4 modes, we claim, are key in structuring communication and building up speeches. So how do you think these 4 modes should be used in a consolation speech? And maybe let's start with naming yourself. How do you do that in a consolation speech? We'll listen to Reagan just in a moment, but...
Yes, I think the challenge is to tell a convincing story. So you're basically a storyteller, I think, when you're trying to console. You don't have... people have not invested formal powers in you as a consolation speaker.
Expert or...
Yeah. So I think...
you speak on behalf of someone, in a sense.
Yes, and I think you also establish yourself as a subject is very important in the consolation speech. You have to appear credible and in a certain sense
find the right position. Is that
yes, perhaps, and also to really be in grief and to show
signal that you're in sync with what's going on. In a sense. Yeah. So let's listen to what Ronald Reagan does as he addresses the nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss.
So, he was supposed to speak to the nation anyhow on the State of the Union, but he had to change the plans. And he says this is a day for mourning and remembering. And he also says, which I find really interesting, Nancy and I, using the first name of the First Lady, or a pain to the core by the tragedy. What does that signal? How is that a way to name yourself?
Yes, he's not only the leader of the free country, so to speak, in the Western world, but he's a family man as well, and he is sort of bringing grief and the loss and the pain into the family, and so by including his wife, I think he is addressing how deeply affected he is in his personal life. And so he's not just sitting there on
top of Capitol Hill. So
yes, alone and just expressing some formal greetings to a nation in grief. But he is trying to convince them that the loss has affected him deeply, also on a personal level.
Yeah, and particularly this. There could be many ways of doing that. If we listen more carefully, we'll hear that he's speaking with he's slowly. He's perhaps lowering his voice in a sense. His face or the way his expressions are not very dramatic. He's holding back, but at the same time being present. One could say, if you try to read the way he plays that out.
Yes, he. I think at moments, in moments as these, his skills as a Hollywood actor is also it comes out, and he has full presence in the picture, and he's sort of drawing the spectators to him because he's charging himself with this holding back. So it's a very forceful and very effective moment of communication, I would say.
Yeah, and he goes on to describe the event a bit from the distance. He describes it as a tragedy, a terrible accident, but then he moves on to describe the Challenger 7, as he describes them, as heroes. They were aware of the dangers, but they overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. They had courage, he says. And then he says, we mourn 7 heroes. And he mentioned the names, Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, and Judith Resning, and so on. So just by mentioning these names very powerfully, slowly, is also a way to position yourself, isn't it?
Yes, and he is also the way that he's moving his voice and his gestures, and they are well. There's always this with the president of the United States that he's very confident in and slow moving, but here it has an extra pitch. I think it is also his qualities as an actor plays out.
And of course he's prepared in a sense. As this is it happened that day, but it's a well prepared speech, and he's prepared. He's probably read it several times. He's prepared for adding presence in a sense.
Yes, he's not just reading a script.
No. So let's listen now to the next sort of, which could be seen as an example of naming reality. How he now goes on after naming the 7 heroes.
Together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us.
So the reality that Ronald Reagan, as a president here, is describing goes beyond merely describing what happened in the accident. He actually doesn't really say much about that. It's not like telling the details of a car accident, but he puts this in a larger framework of describing a reality of not just, in some sense, mankind's interest in freedom and exploring the universe, and the particular role that America holds in that pursuit. Or
yes, he sees them as instrumental to America's cause of expanding into the outer space, and I think when he is leaving out the details of the explosion and the horrible pictures that people have seen on television and so forth, he is actually trying to convey a different message, namely that their sacrifice is a part of a larger story. So it's not meaningless in a profound sense, and this is the
and it's their, and they serve a larger purpose. He goes on after the quote we just heard. He says, "We've grown used to wonders in this century," and he describes the space program and how that is just in his mind beyond barriers. It's humankind just self-realization of a larger human we, so to say, and
and I think it is also, one has to bear in mind that the space program in the 1980s is not undisputed. It's a heavily disputed program, and actually after the moon landing in the late 60s, they hadn't achieved much, and this spaceship idea was a complete failure from day one. And it is also, I think, when he speaks about the loss, one should be aware that this is a political moment as well. But he's trying to weaken the distractive points of that program, and he sees that as part of the nation's story.
But that's a risky enterprise, isn't it? He goes on to describe it's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted; it belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. So, I mean, this is really grand stuff. And in our book, we write about the memorial speech given by Norwegian leader of the Norwegian energy or gas and oil company, Statoil, Helge Lund, after a terror attack in the Algerian desert to a gas plant or to in Amenas. And if we compare these two speeches, I mean, we saw with the Helge Lund speech that he doesn't draw on the core values of Statoil. He doesn't say that being brave, which is a value of Statoil, he doesn't sort of make them heroes of that value, the 5 people who died in the Algerian desert. Whereas Ronald Reagan does the opposite.
Yes, but it's the question of meaning, or the question of framing loss and tragedy into a greater story is a very debated thing to do, and both approaches, the one that is only trying to comfort the families and to sort of isolate the loss from the greater story,
like Helge Lund.
Like Helge Lund did, and this attempt to include the loss in the greater nation story both of them serve different purposes. Because what Reagan is preparing is the memorial funeral, and that they will be buried with great pomp and circumstance, and they will be celebrated as heroes. So the loss of the families will be written into the history of the nation, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's a cultural difference here as well, isn't it?
Yes,
sort of a company and a nation is one thing, and there's a difference between America and Norway as well. So, and I guess it also makes us think about the different interpretations of pain and suffering. So can this suffering be interpreted as something meaningful, and on what grounds? And how do those of us who are not directly affected by it, how do we address that suffering? Do we think of, well, there are, in our tradition there are different approaches, aren't there?
Yes, but the I think the fundamental difference is that the lack of meaning is not a lack of meaning after all, if you look closely, because the stories that surround the loss will always be there. So people will look elsewhere. If the particular thing with Reagan's address is that he's addressing this meaning directly. So he's tapping into the story of United States and the tremendous success history
and he actually,
in the post-war world.
He actually says that there's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. And so there's a comparison here between this Challenger 7 and earlier sort of explorers.
Yes, and Francis Drake was the favorite of Queen Elizabeth, and I think the comparison is also important because it taps into the discovery of mankind. So it's a larger step actually than merely serving the nation.
Yeah, it's beyond America.
Yes, it's beyond. It's humanity,
yeah.
And this is I think the great thing about attempting to do this inclusion of these people's loss into a very large and grand narrative.
Exactly. So how can you, as a speaker, how can different interpretations of suffering, how can you use them when you're a leader and you have to address this? Let's say it's not necessarily a large-scale tragedy, but you're speaking at the memorial of a worker who've passed away.
Yes, again, I think we are not all leaders are not a leader of a nation of the greatest nation in the free West, as it were, in the 80s. But we are. I think we all face, if we are to consolate other workers as leaders, we all face the problem. Could we tap into a story that would sort of make the loss perhaps not meaningful in a profound sense, but somehow let it tap into a greater story, that we were grateful, for example, for this workers' days at the factory or
So in the sense that's consolation speech, or as a memorial speech, it is direct to the present, because you have to sort of capture the feeling of the moment. And genre-wise, it's what is in rhetoric called an epideictic speech. So it's a praise speech.
Yes, it is.
It's a eulogy.
It's a eulogy.
So how can you build up a eulogy when you praise a person? I mean, formally, praising someone who's celebrating their 50th birthday is actually the same thing you're doing in a consolation speech, in a way. So how can you do it?
Well, what Helge Lund did in the speech that you referred to was to praise the qualities of the men. And actually, Ronald Reagan is doing that as well. He's saying that they were brave, and that the courage of embarking on such a great journey is a sign of bravery. And it is also possible to include the virtues of those who have passed away, or those who are sick, or those who are to include them in the narrative of the
company or the school or whatever it is. But usually, if you're a pastor or a priest doing a memorial speech in a funeral, you would start with something else. You'd start with they were born at that particular day, and then so there's a sort of you end with the virtues, but you start with a more, I wouldn't say prosaic, but the sort of the qualities of you were born somewhere in a particular city, you had this and this education. So in some sense, starting too early with the virtues, you have to, you rise the suspense here, you rise the expectancy of the level, in a sense.
Yeah, by just referring to biographical details, you mean?
Exactly.
Yes, and these there's an old trick you can also consider to if you want to consolate, and that is where you are, the place where you are born could also be seen as a place
with a symbol of something.
As a symbol, yes, and a place where certain qualities or certain virtues are particularly well nourished, or even if it's a sign of people coming from this place. It's a very powerful thing to say. The brave people of the northern parts of Norway, for example, they are. Or
they stand in a proud line of fishermen from that particular village or whatever. So Ronald Reagan does a bit of the same. He speaks about how, in the very end of his speech, we'll listen to that, how the crew of the space shuttle honored us.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
So, well, there are many things we could say about this, but what does he do here towards the end?
Well, as the leader of God's country, yes. he has the ability, because he taps into the religious, which you would say, the sphere. There's a certain element in American politics where you can actually say something like to touch the face of God.
It's so grand. Yeah.
Yes, and that's. I think this kind of religion is not the heartfelt European way of being personally committed or something. It belongs to politics, and it's.
So you have to calibrate also the way you console and the language you use, in a sense.
Yes, because if in a very secularized country as Norway or Sweden or something, if you say something like that, you would be looked upon as
strange in some sense.
Yes, and that point to leave the surly bonds of earth, to touch the face of God. That is, in the secularized Europe, an expression of personal felt conviction. But that is not what
that's not what he has in mind.
Reagan is doing.
He's referring to a common thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, to sum it up,
the civil religion thing in the USA is a pool where you can actually draw from,
and you can, or whatever
you can use the metaphors
in a different way that you can in Sweden or Norway or Latvia or wherever. So when you deliver a consolation speech, a few things to think about. One key thing is to name the reality of suffering in a credible way that it's recognizable to those who are affected. Secondly, try to show compassion, but try to do it in an appropriate manner and measure. Position yourself, thirdly, with the mourners and take your mandate from those in grief. And you could carefully listen to whether the consolation speech could be a way to retell what we call the legacy of the organization. It's okay to appeal to the feelings of the audience, but try to do it in a subtle manner, which is sensitive to the culture and the situation. And as we already talked about, speak slowly, but do it firmly. So that's all for now about the consolation speech. We do hope that you don't have to give too many consolation speeches in your career as a leader, but when they come, all the best in addressing suffering in that particular occasion.